you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is the never-ending story, which is our own narrative of our lives and how that shapes our experience and our perceptions and the unfoldment of our lives. So we're going to take a look at how we can take an active hand in crafting these stories in ways that are enlivening and empowering. But before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together. Vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop. And allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables us to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, Rosalind. So good to have you joining us this morning. And so good to have everyone else with us today. We are talking about the never-ending story. And I remember years ago having a conversation with someone, and I said, well, that's your story. And they got very offended. And I think that it was a misunderstanding. But truthfully, if we look at our perspectives on our lives, we are the penultimate storytellers. We are creating this narrative or multiple narratives of our lives, and we live into that story. To say that's your story is not it's not meant to be derogatory. It's meant to be an observation. Oh, that's your story. That's my story. We're all living out these stories. And the thing is that many times we're not even aware that this is a story or a narrative that we've crafted to a great degree. When we interpret events, they're interpreted through a lens, through this narrative that we have about who we are, about how the world is, about interactions, and we see the world through that filter. And we're often so deeply immersed in the story that we don't even recognize that it's a story. We become very much at the effect of it. It's like character acting, right? We sink so deeply into the character that we forget that it's a role that we're playing. And this it comes up all the time because it's such a fundamental aspect of being human, of our human existence. But it came up yesterday in a session that I was doing with someone who has experienced a deep, deep, deep fear about driving on the highway. And this occurred as a result of a very terrifying panic attack that occurred in the midst of driving and in other situations, but they haven't driven on the highway since. And we were talking about how maybe we would get to a point where they would be able to be driving on the highway, and this person is self-aware enough to be able to call out the fact that they were feeling pushed. And I don't know about you, but I've often had an experience where someone will suggest something and I get triggered or have gotten triggered in the past, and then my defenses had arisen. And that's kind of what happened. This person was aware enough to recognize that that's what the dynamic was that was happening. And then, and it was so beautiful, they realized, wow, I've created this whole story. I've created this whole narrative, and that has shaped the way I'm interacting. And they also recognized how pervasive that perspective was, or that story was, throughout all different aspects of their lives. And this person is not in any way alone. We all have our stories, and some of our stories, if we've or if we've been fortunate, some of our stories are really pervasive. I'm sorry, but some of our stories are really supportive, and some of our stories aren't. And the thing is that many of them, maybe most of them, are residing on a level beyond our conscious awareness, where we're not connected to the fact that we're operating out of this story. So one of the things that I say a lot is how important it is to curate our stories. And what I mean by that is, let's become aware of what the story is. We've written it. Now, maybe in some cases we've been handed a story and we adopted it, and we adopted it without any conscious awareness. But we can bring those stories to our conscious awareness. And when we do, we then have the ability to rewrite them, to recraft them. And that's what today's invitation is to recraft these stories in such a way that we empower ourselves with them, rather than limit and confine ourselves. So I invite you to look at what's one of the stories that you have that's operative in your life, that maybe you might want to recraft. So I think for years I had an overarching theme or story that was, or credo even, maybe. Good morning, Dido. Welcome. So good to have you here with us this morning. Let's look at stories together. So I think for years, something that I was living by as kind of an overarching story or theme or whatever is, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So what I found was that I created lots of situations that didn't kill me, but definitely created a lot of struggle, and I was getting so strong, in my resilience, because with that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, I found all kinds of things that challenged me to a very great degree. So now the overarching story that I've adopted and still am feeling into and living into in as conscious a way as possible, particularly when I encounter times that feel like adversity, is that life is happening for me and through me rather than to me. And it's a very different experience. You know, for years, I had a story that I was a failure. And so if that was my story as a failure, I kept creating situations where I could fulfill that story and fail. And so rather than adopting static definitions of ourselves or of myself, what I've come to be moving into is being in the process of life, that I am never evolving, ever learning and expanding consciousness. So what are some of the stories that you might have that might be able to be rewritten? You know, with the I am a failure story, oftentimes like that kind of story can lead one to a place where you stop trying because you know that you're going to fail. Just whether it's true or not, that's just our inner story. And there's a way to curate that potentially to be able to say, well, I try a lot of things. In part of my growth is trying new things or failing forward. Not I am a failure, but I'm willing to encounter failure in the process of learning and developing. So Rosalind says, a recurring story is that I'm always late, makes me feel like there's not enough time. So maybe it's the other way around, Rosalind. Maybe it's that you feel that there's not enough time, which makes you always late. I wonder. But if that's a story, if there's a story that there's not enough time, I think I'm trying to remember. I think that I used to have issues with being late, maybe. But I think maybe you could change the story to I'm becoming more and more in tune with time. Like there's enough time. I have enough time. I know how I manage. I dance well with time, or I dance with time gracefully, or you know how might you recreate that story around being I'm always late, is like I have plenty of time. Maybe experiment with that to see how it feels. You can't create a story that you don't believe. And sometimes we need to transition our stories incrementally, you know, to if you your body and mind isn't going to believe if you're going from I am a failure, like as an identity or as a story, to I can accomplish anything I desire, just like that, because your body and being isn't going to believe it. So maybe there's an incremental statement that you can create, or a news story about a relationship with time. It could even be I'm cultivating an aligned relationship with time. I'm dancing. I'm learning how to dance with time. Whatever it is, when we think that there's not enough time, that's an interesting thing. Is and not enough time for what? And oftentimes it's to get everything I have to do done. And in that, we get to look at the have to do And then we get to look at priorities. And so we're digging deeper, is like, well, are the things that I'm doing in my life aligned with my values and with what makes my heart sing? So are the things, am I aligned with doing the things in my life that I've elected to do? So we can take it down a rabbit hole, which can be useful, because maybe under the story of I'm always late is I'm taking on responsibilities to please others rather than myself. That may be the underlying story, or the underlying dynamic, actually. And then there's a question of, well, I'm pleasing others, possibly. I don't know if this is the case for you, Rosalind. I'm just sort of riffing with, well, what's underneath that not enough time? Because as you're saying that, there's sort of a scarcity, a foundation of scarcity. There's not enough time. What if there is the perfect amount of time? What if you sense well into time, and you're cultivating this connection and relationship, and what if time serves you? Just some suggestions. I'm wondering if any of those resonate in any way. What other kinds of stories might we have? Is I think that there are a lot of stories around enough or not enough. Not enough money, not enough time, not enough. I guess time and money are two big ones, right? Not enough smarts, not enough energy. So a story that I lived with for a long time is I'm exhausted. And the more I would tell myself how exhausted I was, the more exhausted I was. And I'm not saying that changing that story necessarily changes our energy, although I think it can to a certain degree. But saying something, for instance, instead of I'm exhausted, is I'm learning to respect my energy better, or I'm attuning to or connecting to my energy, and I'm aware of the ebbs and flows of my energy rather than I'm exhausted, or I'm learning to be more responsive to the needs of my body. It doesn't mean that the circumstances necessarily change, but our relationship to those circumstances can shift in a way that we're empowering ourselves and giving ourselves life-affirming messages rather than messages that take us down this spiraling path downward. So what else? What other kinds of messaging might you be giving yourselves that we can curate and recreate in a conscious way? So these stories are patterns. They're linked very closely with behavioral patterns, with emotional patterns. Another story is I'm depressed. And I lived a lot of my life with that story. And when we make these overarching statements about our beingness, those statements in and of themselves are filters. So for instance, in the midst of the story, I'm depressed, we don't notice the times that we're not feeling the weight of that depression. And the truth is that our emotions fluctuate, our energies, our energy fluctuates, our awareness fluctuates, our attention fluctuates. And so those stories end up being filters. If I'm depressed, I'm going to look for, if my story is I'm depressed, I'm going to find validation for that story rather than recognizing the moments that I'm not depressed or that I'm maybe even laughing or maybe even peaceful, for example. So the reason that it's so important, like critically important, to curate our stories is that those stories dictate our experience. So Dido says, I had that same story that I was so tired. Now I give myself permission to rest and I don't push myself 24/7. Beautiful, Dido. So it sounds like the story has changed from I'm so tired to I'm respecting the needs of my body and being. When we're tired, we get to rest instead of trying to push through it, which is even more exhausting. So kudos to you. Good for you. That's awesome that you are honoring your body and your needs. So good for you. And this whole idea of pushing ourselves 24/7 is a very enculturated thing. It's like if we're resting, we're not doing anything or we're wasting time because there's not enough time, to go back to what you were saying, Rosalind, right? And to give ourselves the ability to rest, to find that it's sort of it's a greater communion with our body and being. It's a matter of respect and appreciation for ourselves. So this notion of push, push, push is going back to doing things that may not be in alignment with our core desires, or doing things for everybody else, or doing things we don't want to do all the time. That can be exhausting. And so to be able to connect in more deeply to our real needs, that is something that is enlivening. That is something that is expansive. That's something we can gift ourselves. So I'm wondering, now that you give yourself permission to rest, Dido, what is the new story that allowed you to do that? Because seeing what that story is maybe, when we have an enlivening story, then maybe we can recognize it and use it as something that we can expand even more fully into our lives to empower us even more deeply. Because as you're giving yourself permission to rest, what I hear is you're honoring yourself. You're in greater alignment with yourself. You're more attuned to yourself. And that's a beautiful thing. So the stories are never ending. That's how we live our lives. We live through those stories. We're creating our own our own dramas throughout our lives by the way that we interpret our events. And this gets projected out onto the world as well. Like, I remember somebody talking about this other person who really goes after whatever it is they want and isn't bound by the constraints that most of us sort of accept as social constraints. And there was a resentment, sort of, and a jealousy around this other person's freedom. But as the person who felt the jealousy developed their greater sense of freedom and choice, the resentment toward this other person just sort of fell away. And what was all that? It was a story about duty and doing what you have to do, instead of doing, this other person was just like doing what they want to do. So our stories for ourselves shape the way we be, how we feel in our body and being, and also shapes how we interact with others. So with that thought, let's curate our stories to be this wonderful, enlivening adventure. And that's it for today. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I invite you to please like, share, and follow Enlightened World Network and me. The links are in the description. And as always, it is a tremendous pleasure and privilege to be able to be with you these mornings and share musings on what it is to be human. So until next time, so much love to you.